What if a single careless joke sealed your fate in the scorching heat of Arizona, a land where a woman's future is bargained like livestock? Mae Arden made a bold, reckless declaration. She stood before a devil of a horse, a beast no man had ever managed to tame. Laughing, she boldly proclaimed she'd marry whoever could break it. It was a jest meant to silence the parade of persistent suitors, but she never anticipated him an unspoken Apache warrior, a man less than a ghost in the eyes of society stepping out of the shadows. She never expected him to do it with nothing more than a whisper. The dust of Prescott, Arizona in 1883 hung thick in the air, settling on everything: the stiff lace of a lady's collar, the brim of a rancher's hat, and the conscience of a man like Elias Boone. Elias valued three things above all the law: his reputation and his daughter Mae, probably in that order. It was for the sake of the last two that he had purchased the horse. This wasn't just a horse. It was a legend waiting to be born. A midnight black stallion with fire in its eyes, its lineage as wild as the Bradshaw Mountains it was captured from. They called it Diablo, and the name fit. It had crippled two ranch hands, sent a so-called expert from Tucson over the fence with a shattered collarbone. For Elias, Diablo was a tool. His daughter Mae was nearing 21. She had a sharp mind, an even sharper tongue, and a spirit as wild as the stallion. She had rejected every wealthy bachelor from Prescott to Phoenix. Elias thought if a man could conquer the beast, surely he'd have the grit to handle his daughter. It was a crude frontier style of matchmaking, but it was the best he could come up with. "He's magnificent, isn't he?" Luke Tanner said, his voice as smooth as polished leather. Luke stood next to Mae at the corral fence, the afternoon sun glinting off his perfectly styled blonde hair. He was the son of a railroad magnate, the most persistent, and in Elias's eyes, the most promising of Mae's suitors. Mae watched Diablo muscles rippling like dark water as it paced the enclosure. The stallion's intelligence was clear. It wasn't just fighting, it was thinking, anticipating. He's a prisoner, Mae, and he hates it. Everything of value must eventually be owned. Land, gold, even beauty. His gaze lingered on her proprietary confidence in his eyes that made her skin crawl. "My father agrees. He says a man who can break that horse can build an empire." A crowd had gathered. It was Saturday, and the spectacle of another man trying to ride Diablo was better than any saloon show. Elias stood on the porch of his stately home, arms crossed, watching like a king surveying his court. Today was Luke Tanner's turn. He wore the finest saddle, the sharpest spurs, and the most arrogant smile Mae had ever seen. She hated it. Hated being the prize in this masculine contest. Her father's unsubtle message was clear. She was like the horse wild needing taming, needing ownership. Luke stepped into the corral, swaggering with the confidence of a man who had never known failure. Diablo stopped pacing. The horse lowered its head, ears flattened, and a deep snort rumbled from its chest. The air crackled with tension, thick as dust. The contest was short. Luke managed to get the saddle on, but the moment he threw his leg over, Diablo exploded. It wasn't just bucking. It was a cyclone of fury, a furious flurry of hooves and teeth. Luke was airborne in seconds, landing in a crumpled heap against the far fence. The crowd erupted, half laughter, half disappointed groans. Luke, his face the color of a thundercloud, limped out of the corral, brushing red dust off his expensive trousers. Abel Crick, a weathered rancher with a face like a dry riverbed, spat tobacco. "That horse ain't meant for a saddle, Elias. He's pure spirit. Some things ain't meant to be broken." Mae's frustration, humiliation, rebellious anger boiled over. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmuring crowd. "That's because you're all using force," she declared, eyes flashing. She didn't know where the words came from, only that they felt right. She was tired of being managed, of being courted with displays of wealth and power. She wanted something more, something real. even if she couldn't name it. Her father shot her a warning look. Luke Tanner's face was a mask of wounded pride. Fueled by the crowd's sudden silence, Mae doubled down. She laughed brightly, though it held a hint of hysteria, and made the joke that would shatter her world. "You know what?" she called out, gesturing grandly toward the heaving stallion. "Forget fortunes and last names. I'll marry whoever tames this horse. I'll marry any man who shows a little understanding instead of just brute force." The crowd chuckled. It was a fine joke from the judge's fiery daughter. A woman's silly romantic notion. Luke Tanner sneered openly. Elias Boone's face tightened with fury at the public spectacle. The words hung heavy in the air, audacious and impossible. Mae Arden felt a thrill of victory. She had made her point. She had turned their ridiculous contest into something absurd. And then, from the shadows of the nearby livery stable, a figure detached itself. He moved with an unnatural silence through the dusty, noisy street. He was Apache. His high cheekbones, the straight black hair, flowing down past his shoulders, and his buckskin clothes blended with the landscape itself. To them he was nameless, faceless, one of the people living at the edge of their world, seen but never acknowledged. He was lean, but his stillness held a coiled strength, a patience that spoke louder than words. His dark, unreadable eyes fixed on the horse, not on Mae or the stunned crowd. Diablo, still agitated, snorted and pawed at the ground, but his wild eyes now locked on the stranger. A nervous whisper rippled through the crowd. "What's he doing here?" The man opened the corral gate and slipped inside, closing it gently behind him. He held no rope, no whip, no saddle. His hands were empty. He was a ghost walking into a storm, and the crowd held its breath. The silence that fell over them was thick, almost suffocating, drowning out the usual Saturday afternoon noise. All eyes were on the two figures in the corral, the untamable black stallion and the silent Apache man who dared to enter his realm. Mae felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her bold joke, so freeing moments ago, now felt like a lead weight. The man, later known as Rokan, didn't approach Diablo directly. He moved with a slow, deliberate circle around the corral's edge, his movements fluid and unthreatening. He kept his eyes lowered, his posture relaxed, offering peace, not challenge. It was a stark contrast to Luke Tanner's swagger. Diablo watched him, every muscle tensed. The horse's ears flicked, tracking Rokan's silent path. The furious panic began to subside, replaced by a watchful curiosity. Diablo snorted, sending up a plume of dust, but he held his ground. "What in God's name does he think he's doing?" Elias muttered under his breath, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. "This is a farce. He'll be killed," Luke added grimly, satisfied. "It'll serve her right for her outburst." Mae ignored them both. Her gaze was fixed on the scene, her hands gripping the top rail of the fence so tightly, her knuckles went white. She had never seen anything like this. The man was speaking a language without words, a language of pure intention. After completing his circle, Rokan stopped. He was still a good 20 feet from the horse. Slowly he crouched, making himself smaller, less of a threat. He remained still for what felt like an eternity. The sun blazed down, casting long shadows across the corral. Finally, Diablo took a hesitant step forward, then another. He lowered his massive head, nostrils flaring, scenting the air. He was no longer a devil. He was simply an animal, cautious, intelligent, trying to understand the strange, calm creature who had entered his space. Rokan didn't move a muscle. He simply waited. The horse inched closer until its whiskered nose was only a few feet from the man's knee. The crowd gasped in unison. Abel Crick, the old rancher, slowly removed his hat, as if in the presence of something sacred. Then Rokan began to speak. His voice was too low for anyone at the fence to hear. It was a soft, rhythmic murmur, more like the sound of a gentle stream than a human voice, a whisper. It flowed into the dry air, a current that seemed to mesmerize the stallion. Mae leaned forward, straining to hear. But it was impossible. She could only watch the effect. Diablo's entire body seemed to soften. The tension drained from his powerful shoulders. His head lowered further, and his ears, once rigid with alarm, flickered and relaxed. He nudged Rokan's shoulder with his nose. Slowly, gracefully, Rokan rose to his feet. He never stopped his quiet words. With deliberate slowness, he lifted his hand, ensuring the horse could see every intention before he made his move. He laid his palm flat against the stallion's powerful neck. Diablo didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into the touch, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. Rokan stroked the horse's neck, his murmurs never ceasing. He walked alongside the stallion, his hand never leaving his coat. Then he did something that made Mae Arden's heart leap into her throat. He leaned his weight against the horse's side, and with a fluid, effortless motion, he swung himself onto Diablo's bare back. There was no bucking, no eruption of rage. The horse stood as calmly as an old cow pony, his ears twitching as he listened to the man on his back. Rokan gently took hold of the horse's mane, leaned forward, and whispered something directly into his ear. Then, with the slightest pressure from his knees, he urged the horse forward. Diablo walked calmly, steadily around the corral, his steps sure and easy. No longer was he Diablo the devil. He was just a horse, and he had found a partner, not a master. The crowd, stunned into silence, slowly broke into a wave of astonished murmurs and exclamations. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. It was like watching a miracle, or perhaps some kind of magic trick. Rokan guided the horse back to the center of the corral and slid off its back as easily as he had climbed on. He gave Diablo one final pat on the neck before turning to face the shocked crowd. His dark eyes swept over the stunned faces until they landed on Mae. He didn't smile. He didn't boast. His expression was calm and solemn, as if he had simply fulfilled an unspoken promise. Mae's own words came crashing into her mind with the weight of a physical blow. "I'll marry whoever tames this horse." Her voice echoed a mocking, triumphant ghost haunting her thoughts. It had been a joke, a flippant, angry jest meant to put men like Luke Tanner in their place. It was never meant to be taken seriously, and it certainly wasn't supposed to be answered by a nameless Apache who had just achieved the impossible. Elias Boone looked from the tamed horse to Rokan, then to his daughter. His face went pale, his lips a thin, tight line. In his world, a man's and a woman's word was their bond. To go back on it publicly would be the ultimate disgrace, a stain on the Boone name that would never wash out. Luke Tanner stepped forward, his face twisted in a sneer of disbelief and rage. "This is a trick. Some kind of savage witchcraft. It doesn't count." The girl was joking Elias. "Tell them," Luke demanded. But Elias's eyes remained locked with Rokan's. In the warrior's gaze, he saw no trickery, only calm, unyielding expectation. Rokan had answered the challenge laid before him. Mae felt a wave of dizziness. The faces of the townsfolk blurred before her eyes. Some looked amused, some shocked, some contemptuous. They were all waiting to see if the high and mighty Mae Arden was a woman of her word, or just a foolish girl who spoke before she thought. Her life as she knew it was over. It had ended, not with a bang, but with a whisper in the dust. The aftermath was a suffocating silence, followed by a storm. Inside Elias Boone's house, the heavy velvet curtains were drawn against the prying eyes of the town, but they couldn't shut out the disgrace. "You will not go through with this," Elias stated, his voice dangerously low. He paced the length of his study, his hands clasped behind his back. The room, filled with leather-bound books and a polished mahogany desk, had always been a symbol of order and authority. Now it felt like a cage. "It was what I said," Mae replied, her voice barely a whisper. She stood by the window, her body rigid. She felt strangely detached, as if watching a play about someone else's ruined life. It was a jest. A moment of female hysteria. Elias thundered, spinning to face her. "No one in their right mind would hold you to it. Luke is right. It was some kind of Indian trick." Was it? Mae shot back, a spark of her old fire returning. Or was it that he showed the animal respect instead of trying to beat it into submission? What he did was more masterful than anything Luke Tanner could do in 100 years. The words escaped before she could stop them, a defense of the nameless man she hadn't even known she possessed. Respect. Elias laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. He's a savage from the reservation, Mae. He has no name, no property, no standing. He is for all intents and purposes not even a citizen under the law. Marrying him is not just social suicide, it is madness. It would make you an outcast. It would make me a laughingstock. The weight of his words pressed down on her. He was right. In their world, she would be an outcast. The women who once called her friend would cross the street to avoid her. She would become the town scandal, the girl who threw herself away on an Apache, and yet a stubborn kernel of pride refused to be crushed. Her father and Luke Tanner represented a world of control of ownership where she was nothing more than another asset to manage. Her foolish, reckless words had been a rebellion against that. To back down now to let her father smooth it over and pretend it never happened would feel like an even deeper defeat. It would mean admitting that her words, her promises meant nothing. My word is my word, Mae said, lifting her chin. It's a lesson you yourself taught me. Elias Boone stared at her, his face a battleground of fury and dawning, horrified respect. He was trapped by his own code of honor hoisted on his family's name. Public integrity was everything. A public declaration, even one made in jest, was a debt that had to be paid. The town of Prescott didn't wait to pass judgment. The tale of Diablo's taming and his daughter's shocking promise spread like wildfire. Luke Tanner, his ego shattered, became the story's most venomous narrator, painting Mae as a wanton fool and Rokan as a dark sorcerer. The man himself had simply faded back into the shadows after the event, but 2 days later he returned. He didn't come to the front door. He simply appeared at the back of the property near the stables as the sun set. A servant's hushed voice announced his presence, filled with scandal. Elias met him outside. Mae watched from the kitchen window, her heart pounding in her chest, each beat frantic. The two men stood a few feet apart, a chasm of culture and prejudice separating them. Elias stiff and formal in his dark suit, and Rokan still and watchful in his buckskins. The conversation was brief. The judge's posture was rigid, burdened with defeat. He returned to the house, his face ashen. "He'll take you," he said, his gaze never meeting hers. "He has a small piece of land granted by treaty a few miles up near the San Pedro River. He says he'll build a proper shelter. The wedding is in 3 days." The word wedding sounded obscene. There would be no white dress, no flowers, no well wishes. The circuit judge, a man named Arthur Peel, who owed Elias a significant favor, would perform the service. It would be a quiet legal transaction, just enough to fulfill the promise and contain the scandal. The next 3 days passed in a blur of misery. Mae's friends stopped calling. The household staff spoke in whispers, their eyes filled with pity and morbid curiosity. She packed a single trunk, her hands moving mechanically. What is one trunk for a life she couldn't possibly imagine? She packed sturdy dresses, her riding boots, a few cherished books, and a pearl-handled derringer her mother had given her. Tucking it deep into the folds of a woolen shawl, the wedding took place in Elias's study. It was a grim, hollow affair. Judge Peel looked uncomfortable, rushing through the words, as if they burned his tongue. Mae wore a simple gray dress. She felt cold numb. Rokan stood beside her, silent as stone. He wore a clean, simple tunic and leggings. He smelled of sage and wood smoke, as foreign as the man himself. When Judge Peel asked, "Do you, Mae Arden, take this man?" he faltered, unsure of what name to use. Rokan's voice, when it came, was low and clear. "Rokan," he said simply. "Take Rokan to be your lawfully wedded husband." Mae's voice was a choked whisper. "I do." She couldn't bring herself to look at him. her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall, focusing on the intricate patterns of the wallpaper, trying to escape the surreal nightmare her life had become. They were pronounced man and wife. No kiss, no celebration. Only the scratch of Judge Peel's pen on the certificate sealing her fate. Outside, a single horse waited Diablo. He was saddled not with an expensive leather creation like Luke Tanner's, but with a simple, functional blanket saddle. He stood patiently nuzzling Rokan's shoulder as he approached. Another horse, a sturdy mare, was tethered nearby for Mae. Her father approached her as she stood by the mare. "You made this choice, Mae," he said, his voice strained. He pressed a small, heavy pouch into her hand. "This is all I can do for you now. Don't expect to be welcome back here." The words hit Mae like a whip crack, sharper than any pain she had ever known. Tears stung her eyes, but she forced them back. She would not give him or anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Without a word, she mounted the mare. Rokan was already on Diablo waiting. He looked at her with his dark, unreadable eyes before turning his horse and riding down the road, away from the town, away from the life she had known. Mae cast one last glance at the grand house she had grown up in, then followed her husband into an uncertain future, a prisoner of her own reckless words. The ride to Rokan's land was silent. He rode ahead, his figure lean and perfectly balanced on Diablo's back, moving as one with the horse. Mae followed the dust from the trail, coating her dress and filling her lungs. The sun beat down relentlessly, the landscape growing wilder with every mile. The neat fences and properties of Prescott gave way to open rangeland dotted with mesquite and saguaro cacti, jagged rock formations stretching as far as the eye could see. They rode for hours. The silence stretched between them, like a living thing, heavy with unspoken questions and resentments. Mae's mind raced. What was she supposed to do now? What was she supposed to say? This man, her husband, was a complete stranger, a man from a world she couldn't even begin to understand. She was terrified, but a stubborn part of her refused to show it. She straightened her back, focused on the horizon, and mimicked a confidence she didn't feel. They finally arrived as dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and violet. His home was nothing like she expected. She had imagined a shack or a crude hut. Instead, nestled in a small grove of cottonwood trees by a trickling creek, stood a small but sturdy adobe structure. The house was humble, a far cry from the mansion she had left behind, but it was solid and clearly built with care. Smoke rose lazily from a chimney pipe. Rokan dismounted and began unsaddling the horses without a word. He moved with unhurried, efficient grace. Mae, unsure of what to do, slid off her mare, every muscle in her body aching. He gestured with his chin toward the adobe. It was a simple, clear command. "Go inside." She hesitated, then pushed open the heavy wooden door. The interior was a single room, larger than she had expected. It was sparse but immaculately clean. A fire burned in a small, well-made hearth, casting a warm glow across the smooth earth walls. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center, while a raised platform bed covered in furs and woven blankets was tucked into one corner. Cooking pots and utensils hung neatly from pegs on the wall. It was the home of a man who lived a simple, solitary life. There was no room for her here, no space for her trunk, her books, or her former existence. A few minutes later, Rokan entered, carrying her trunk as if it weighed nothing. He set it down against the wall, the fine, polished luggage looking absurdly out of place. He then moved to the hearth, stirring a pot hanging over the fire. The scent of stew rabbit and wild herbs filled the room. He ladled some into a wooden bowl and set it on the table with a piece of flatbread. Then he served himself and sat down. He didn't invite her to eat. He simply began his meal, his gaze focused on his bowl. The message was clear. He had fulfilled his obligation by bringing her here. He had provided shelter and food, nothing more. Mae's stomach growled, but her pride wouldn't let her show her hunger. She would not let him treat her like a stray dog to be fed. She sat on the edge of the cot, her back to him, pretending to study the woven blanket. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the crackling fire and the soft sounds of Rokan eating. When he was finished, he cleaned his bowl and utensils with water from a bucket and set them aside to dry. Then he took a blanket from the bed and laid it on the floor near the hearth. He lay down, pulling the blanket over him and turning his back to the room. In moments, his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. Mae was left alone in the darkness, wide awake. The bed was hers, but the gesture felt less like chivalry and more like a statement of distance. He was sleeping on the floor, a stranger in his own home to accommodate the unwanted woman who now occupied it. Tears of frustration and despair finally came. She cried silently, muffling her sobs in the furs, hoping he wouldn't hear. This was her new life, a world of silence shared with a man who had won her like a trophy, and now seemed to have no idea what to do with her. The days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Rokan rose before dawn, vanishing for hours to hunt or trap. He'd return with game, a brace of quail, a rabbit, or sometimes fish from the creek. He'd prepare the food and they'd eat in silence. Rokan slept on the floor. Mae, trying to be useful, swept the dirt floors, kept the fire burning, and washed their few dishes. She learned by watching him, noting how he ground corn into meal, how he found the tender roots of plants. He never told her what to do, but he never stopped her either. It was a silent apprenticeship. One afternoon, desperate for something to occupy her mind, she unpacked her books. She sat at the table, opening one and beginning to read. Rokan returned, pausing in the doorway. His eyes fell on the book in her hands. Mae couldn't read his expression. It wasn't disapproval exactly. It was more curiosity, as if the book was something from a different world altogether. He didn't say a word. He simply went about his work, but Mae felt his awareness of her in a new way. The loneliness inside her was a physical ache. She missed conversation. She missed music. She missed being acknowledged. Her husband treated her like a piece of furniture, a silent object that merely shared his space. Her resentment festered. This was her prison, and Rokan was her jailer. One evening, unable to take it any longer, Mae burst out, her voice raw from disuse. "Why did you do it?" Rokan, who had been sharpening a knife by the fire, froze. He didn't turn to look at her. "Why did you tame the horse?" She pressed, needing to shatter the oppressive silence. "Did you know about my foolish promise? Did you do it to win me, to humiliate my father?" He remained silent for a long moment, then spoke without turning his head. His voice was deeper than she remembered, a low rumble. "The horse," he said, his English slow and deliberate, as if translating each word from another language. "He had a strong spirit, like you. It is wrong to break a spirit. It should be understood." He said nothing more. He returned to sharpening his knife, the rhythmic sound of stone against steel filling the quiet room. Mae stared at his back, stunned. It was the most he had ever said to her, and his words began to chip away at the wall of resentment she had so carefully built. He hadn't been thinking of her, or her father, or the prize. He had seen a kindred spirit in the corral, a wild thing being brutalized, and he had intervened. Her marriage wasn't an act of ambition or revenge. It was to him simply a consequence of compassion. The realization didn't make her feel any less trapped, but it changed the nature of her prison and her jailer. Rokan's words echoed in Mae's mind for days. It is wrong to break a spirit. It should be understood. He had been talking about the horse, but Mae knew with a certainty that unsettled her that he had been talking about her as well. He saw her, not as a prize or a scandal or a burden, but as a spirit that refused to be broken. The understanding didn't magically fix everything. The silence still held, but its quality began to change. It was less oppressive, more contemplative. Mae started observing him more closely, not as her captor, but as a man. She noticed the way his hands, though rough and calloused, were gentle when he tended to a small wound on the mare's leg. She saw the quiet reverence with which he watched the sunrise each morning. He lived in a constant silent conversation with the world around him, a language she was only beginning to understand. One afternoon, as she was gathering water from the creek, a rattlesnake coiled in her path, its tail vibrating in a blur of warning. Mae froze, her heart gripping in her chest. Before she could scream, an arrow hissed past her ear and pinned the snake's head to the ground. Rokan emerged from the trees, bow in hand. He moved forward calmly, dispatching the still, writhing snake with his knife, then looked at her. "Pay attention," he said. It wasn't a scolding, just a simple statement of fact. The land speaks. You must learn to listen. And he showed her what to listen for, the cry of a jay signaling a predator, the way the cottonwood leaves turned just before a storm, the subtle tracks that told the story of which animals had passed by the night before. He taught her the names of the plants, ones she could eat, ones that could be used for medicine, and the ones that were poisonous. He never lectured. He would just point. "Okoteo," he'd say, indicating the spiny plant. "Tea from the flower is for coughs." Or he'd crumble a leaf from a creosote bush. "Smell. This is the smell of rain coming." Mae, the girl who had once studied Latin and French literature, now found herself a student in a new, more vital school. At first she was clumsy, but she was intelligent, and a keen observer. The days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Rokan rose before the crack of dawn, disappearing into the wilderness for hours hunting or setting traps. He'd return with food: quail, a rabbit, or sometimes fish from the creek. He would prepare it in silence, and they would eat in the same quiet way. Afterward, he'd sleep on the floor. Mae, trying to make herself useful, swept the dirt floors, kept the fire going, and washed their few dishes. She learned by watching him how he ground corn into meal, how he found the tender roots of plants. He never gave her instructions, but he never stopped her either. It was a silent apprenticeship. One afternoon, desperate for something to do, Mae unpacked her books. She sat at the table and began to read. Rokan came back and paused in the doorway. His dark eyes landed on the book in her hands. Mae couldn't read his expression. It wasn't disapproval, not exactly. It was more like curiosity, as if the book were an artifact from another world. He said nothing and went about his work, but Mae felt his attention on her in a new way. The loneliness pressed on her sharp and real. She missed conversation. She missed music. She missed being noticed. Her husband treated her like furniture, an object in the room. Silently breathing, sharing space with him. Her resentment grew. This was her prison, and Rokan was her jailer. One evening, unable to stand it anymore, Mae's voice broke the silence. "Why did you do it?" Rokan, sharpening a knife by the fire, froze. He didn't turn to look at her. "Why did you tame the horse?" she pressed, needing to break the silence that weighed them down. "Did you know about my foolish promise? Did you do it to win me, to humiliate my father?" He remained silent for a long moment before speaking. His voice was deeper than she remembered, a low rumble. "The horse," he said, his English slow, deliberate, as if each word were translated from another language. "He had a strong spirit. Like you, it is wrong to break a spirit. It should be understood." He said nothing more. He returned to sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel filling the room. Mae stared at his back, stunned. It was the most he had ever said to her. His words chipped away at the wall of resentment she'd built so carefully. He hadn't been thinking of her, her father, or the prize. He had seen a kindred spirit in the corral, a wild thing being brutalized, and he had intervened. Her marriage wasn't an act of revenge or ambition. It was to him simply the consequence of compassion. The realization didn't make Mae feel less trapped, but it changed the nature of her prison and her jailer. Rokan's words echoed in Mae's mind for days. It is wrong to break a spirit. It should be understood. He had spoken of the horse, but Mae knew with unsettling certainty that he had also spoken of her. He saw her not as a prize or a scandal or a burden, but as a spirit that refused to be broken. The understanding didn't magically solve everything. The silence still reigned, but its quality began to shift. It was less oppressive, more contemplative. Mae began to observe him more closely, not as her captor, but as a man. She noticed the way his hands, rough and calloused, were gentle when he tended to a small wound on his mare's leg. She saw the quiet reverence with which he watched the sunrise each morning. He lived in a constant, silent conversation with the world around him, a language she was only just beginning to understand. One afternoon, while Mae was gathering water from the creek, a rattlesnake coiled in her path, its tail vibrating with an angry hiss. Mae froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Before she could scream, an arrow shot past her ear, pinning the snake's head to the ground. Rokan stepped out from the trees, bow in hand. He moved forward calmly, dispatching the still, writhing snake with his knife, then looked at her. "Pay attention," he said. It wasn't a scolding. It was simply a statement of fact. The land speaks. You must learn to listen. He showed her what to listen for: the call of a jay, warning of a predator, the way the leaves of the cottonwoods turned before a rainstorm, the subtle tracks that told the story of animals passing by in the night. He taught her the names of the plants, ones that could be eaten, others that could heal, and the ones that were poisonous. He never gave lectures. He would simply point. "Okoteo," he would say, indicating a spiny plant. "Tea from the flower is for coughs." Or he'd crumble a leaf from a creosote bush. "Smell. This is the smell of rain coming." Mae, the girl who had once studied Latin and French literature, now found herself a student in a new, more vital school. At first she was clumsy, but she was sharp and a quick learner. The tracks led straight out of town toward the reservation. "That has nothing to do with us," Mae Arden said flatly. "We haven't left this land in a week." "Oh, I think it does," Luke Tanner sneered. "Everyone knows what happens when his kind gets a little taste of our world. They get greedy. A woman isn't enough. They want our cattle, our property." It was a lie, transparent and thin, and Mae knew it instantly. This wasn't about cattle. It was about pride, prejudice, and Sterling's bruised ego. He had gathered a posse fueled by whiskey and racism to settle a personal score. One of the men, a rancher named Ridge Barton, his face flushed with drink, spat on the ground. "We know your tricks, Apache. Witching horses, stealing women, stealing cattle. That's easy after that." Rokan remained silent, his eyes scanning the men, assessing the threat. He wasn't looking at their faces. He was studying their hands, their rifles resting in saddle scabbards, the way they gripped the reins. There were no tracks here. Rokan's voice, calm and even, carried a weight that made a few men shift uncomfortably. "The ground is hard. A dozen men on horseback leave a clear trail. You did not. You came from the south road from town." Sterling's face flushed with anger at being so easily read. "Are you calling me a liar, savage?" "I am stating a fact," Rokan replied. This calm defiance only enraged Sterling further. "That's enough. We're taking you in. You'll get a trial of sorts." The men behind him chuckled darkly. They all knew the kind of trial an Apache accused of rustling would get, one that ended with a rope. Two men began to dismount, reaching for their ropes. This was it, the moment of decision. The world Mae had come from was here offering a violent, ugly kind of rescue. They saw her as a victim, someone to be saved. They saw her husband as a thief, a lesser man to be disposed of. But Mae no longer saw a savage. She saw the man who had shown her how to listen to the land. She saw the man who slept on the floor so she could have a bed. She saw the man who had faced a storm to fix their roof, who had saved her from a snake, who had respected her spirit when no one else had. In that flash of clarity, she knew what she had to do. She moved. Before anyone could react, she darted into the adobe. The men outside tensed, thinking she was running to hide. But she emerged a moment later, not with a white flag of surrender, but with a pearl-handled derringer in her hand. It was a small weapon, a lady's gun, but the twin barrels looked deadly serious under the harsh sunlight. She didn't point it at Sterling. She walked straight to Diablo, tethered nearby, and pressed the muzzle against his sleek black neck. The horse stood perfectly still, trusting the woman who had cared for him, bringing him water and sweet grass every day. "The first man who takes another step toward my husband, Mae," said, her voice ringing with cold, absolute fury, "will force me to shoot this horse." The very horse this whole ridiculous affair started over. The men stopped dead in their tracks. Sterling stared at her, his jaw slack in astonishment. "Are you insane, Mae? That's a $1,000 animal." "He's my husband's horse," Mae retorted, her eyes blazing. "And this is my husband's land. You are trespassing and you are making false accusations. You want a thief, then go find one. But you will not take an innocent man from his home. Not today." Her defense of Rokan, her willingness to destroy such a valuable animal, was so unexpected, so contrary to how a rescued woman should behave, that it threw the entire posse into confusion. They had come expecting a grateful, tearful victim, not a defiant protector. Rokan watched her, and for the briefest moment a look of profound astonishment crossed his face, quickly replaced by fierce, burning pride. "She's bewitched," Barton muttered, one of the men, unnerved. "Look at her. It's like she's not herself." "I've never been more myself in my entire life," Mae shot back. "Now get off my land." Sterling, seeing he was losing control of his men and the situation grew desperate. "Don't listen to her. She's been out here too long. Her mind's gone. Rush them." But Luke Tanner's command was hesitant, and the men didn't move. They were ranchers, not murderers, and the sight of the judge's daughter holding a gun to her own prized horse, defending an Apache, had shaken them. What had started as a simple drunken lynching had spiraled into something much darker. Then a new rider appeared on the rise, one man on a fine gray horse, riding hard. It was Elias Boone. Elias reined his horse to a skidding halt, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with the swift assessment of a man used to the law, an armed posse. His daughter holding a derringer, to the famous black stallion, and Rokan standing like a rock at her side. A flicker of something crossed his face. Was it fear? Was it pride? He looked at Mae. "Luke Tanner, what is the meaning of this?" Elias demanded, his voice booming with courtroom authority. Luke Tanner, momentarily flustered by the judge's arrival, quickly regained his composure. "Judge Boone, thank goodness we've come to rescue Mae. This savage stole cattle from Abel Creek. We were bringing him in for justice." Elias's sharp eyes narrowed. "Did you witness him stealing these cattle, Mr. Tanner?" "Well, no, but the tracks Abel Creek reported his cattle stolen less than 3 hours ago." Elias cut him off, his tone cold. "I was with him when he did. It would have been impossible for you to gather a posse and track him here in that time. Especially since, as I understand it, you've been in town all day, stirring up trouble at the saloon." The color drained from Luke's face. He had been caught in his lie by the one man whose approval he had craved most. Elias turned his attention to the other men. "And as for the rest of you, Ridge, Barton, Thorn, Pike, you're cattlemen. You know as well as I do that a rustler's tracks don't simply vanish. If you had any real evidence, you would have brought it to Sheriff Holt, not formed a lynch mob." The men shifted uncomfortably, their bravado evaporating under Elias's legalistic glare. They looked down at their boots, at their saddles, anywhere but at him. They had been played for fools by Luke Tanner, their own prejudices used against them. "This man," Elias said, gesturing toward Rokan, "is by law Mae's husband. This land is legally his. You are an armed mob, trespassing on private property and making threats. Disband and go home before I have Sheriff Holt arrest every last one of you." Grumbling ashamed, the men began to turn their horses around. There was no arguing with the judge when he used that tone. Luke Tanner, however, was consumed with a desperate, sputtering rage. "You choose him over me," he screamed at Mae. His handsome face twisted into an ugly mask of fury and animal. "After everything my family can offer you, he is twice the man you will ever be. Mae stood her ground, her voice calm but firm as she lowered the derringer, though her gaze remained steady. "Now leave." Defeated and humiliated, Luke wrenched the reins and galloped away, his posse trailing behind him like whipped dogs. An awkward silence settled over the homestead, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Elias dismounted, his movements stiff. He looked from his daughter's determined face to Rokan's impassive one. He glanced around at the small adobe, the budding garden, the clear creek. What he saw was not a prison, but a home. "The pouch I gave you," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. "I had hoped you would use it to buy passage away from here, away from him." "I am not leaving," Mae replied simply. There was no defiance in her tone, only certainty. Elias nodded slowly, a long, weary sigh escaping him. "I received a letter this morning from your aunt in San Francisco. She heard of the marriage. She offered to have you, to give you a new life when no one knows your story." He held out the letter. Mae looked at the envelope, at the elegant script that promised a return to her old world, a world of comfort, society, and conversation, a world without silence. Then she looked at Rokan, who was watching her with dark eyes, holding a question he would never ask aloud. He was giving her a choice. His stillness was a form of freedom. She shook her head and pushed the letter back toward her father. "Tell Aunt Josephine that I am grateful," she said. "But my story is here now. I am not ashamed of it." For the first time, a genuine, unguarded emotion broke through her father's stern facade. He looked at the strong, self-possessed woman his daughter had become, standing shoulder to shoulder with a man he had once called a savage. And he saw that she was not broken nor bewitched. She was whole. He turned his gaze to Rokan. "You have taught her something I could not," he said, the admission costing him a great deal of pride. "To stand strong on her own terms." Mae simply nodded at Rokan in silent acknowledgement. Elias Boone lingered for a moment, as if there were 1,000 things left unsaid, but no words to express them. Finally he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking back. He was leaving her in a world he couldn't understand, but it seemed he finally understood that it was where she belonged. As the dust from her father's horse settled, Mae and Rokan stood together in the quiet of the evening. The immediate danger had passed, but the confrontation had changed everything. The unspoken things that had hung between them for months had been burned away in the heat of the standoff. Mae turned to him. "I was afraid," she admitted. "You were not," Rokan corrected her gently. "Fear is a stone that sinks. You were a hawk that flies into the wind." I saw you, he added. The simple words filled her with a warmth that spread through her entire being. He had always seen her. From the very beginning he had seen her spirit. She looked up at him, at the quiet strength in his face, the deep wisdom in his eyes. He was no longer a stranger, no longer her jailer. He was her partner, her protector, her husband. Slowly she reached out and took his hand. His calloused fingers closed around hers, a firm, warm anchor in the vast, wild landscape. It was a simple gesture, but it was a promise, a vow renewed, not by force nor by a foolish joke, but by choice. Their life would not be easy. The world beyond their small piece of land might never understand them, but as they stood hand in hand, the sun setting behind the mountains, they faced their future, not in silence and fear, but with a quiet, shared language of the heart. They had found each other in the most unlikely of ways, two strong spirits who had refused to be broken and who had finally truly been understood. And so Mae's careless joke became the beginning of her true life. Her story wasn't just about romance, it was about looking beyond the surface, beyond society's prejudices, to find a truth worth fighting for. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in loud declarations, but in a quiet, steady presence. Mae and Rokan built a life, not on shared words, but on a shared understanding of heart and spirit. If you were moved by Mae and Rokan's journey, from strangers to soulmates, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a story of courage and unconventional love. And most importantly, if you want more tales that sweep you away to another time and place, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work